I'm Greg Smith, and over the next year I'll be your guide around the world and back and forth through the ages as we discover the Catholic story and how the Church has preserved the faith once and for all given to the saints. Welcome to the premiere of One Whirling Adventure. In this episode, we have a lot of places to go, a lot of things to see, and a lot of stories to tell. But before we take off, let me just share a few pre-flight thoughts about this program and where we're going to be going over the next year together. You know, big stories are made up of lots of small events. Somebody did something here, and then something happened over there. Over time, they accumulate and they take shape. And then when you look back, you begin to see patterns and connections. The movement and contours of the story emerge. You come to grasp what mattered and why and how it all fits into the overall narrative. And really, that's the purpose of One Whirling Adventure. Telling lots of little stories about people, places, and things that all add up to become the big story of the Catholic faith over time. And so, there will be three types of episodes in this program: stories behind the saints, uniquely Catholic objects, and virtual pilgrimages. Now, the schedule of planned episodes is on the website, so you can go look there. And as a practical matter, story behind the saint and uniquely Catholic object episodes will all be an hour long, and they'll be on Tuesday nights at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Virtual pilgrimages will be 90 minutes long, and they'll be on Sunday nights at 7 p.m. And in this first season, we're going to be visiting France and Rome and Ireland and Jerusalem. And as soon as the COVID restrictions on travel are eased, I'll be leading some real-life pilgrimages to those places over the next 2 years. So watch the website and the Facebook page for more information on that. Oh yeah, and about Facebook, One Whirling Adventure has its own Facebook page. And so between episodes, I'll be posting extra information, reflections, thoughts, videos, stuff that didn't make it into the episodes. So go and like and follow that page to keep up with all of that. Now, about tonight. This premiere is going to be kind of like a sampler plate with a taste of each of the three episode types. You'll hear the story behind a saint, Bartolome Gutierrez. You'll take a virtual pilgrimage to the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. And you're going to learn about a uniquely Catholic object, Marian processions around the world. Between the three segments tonight, we'll share a few previews of other learning opportunities that Lane has coming up. Okay, 2 final points before we take off. First, if you've purchased a digital passport or an all-access pass, then you should have received an invitation link for the virtual after party tonight. When this premiere ends in about 90 minutes, log out of this Zoom call and log back in through the after party link. We're going to have an open discussion where you can share comments or thoughts. You can ask me questions about the things you saw in tonight's episode or what's coming up in future episodes. And if you're joining us with a free pass for this premiere, welcome. We're so glad to have you aboard. We hope that you like what you see and that you'll want to join us for future episodes and everything else that Lane has to offer by getting a digital passport or an all-access pass. Oh, and by the way, all One Whirling Adventure episodes will be stored online for those with passports and passes. So if you miss one, you can always just catch up, or you can binge watch the catalog, just like it was Netflix. Okay, and so with all of our pre-flight talk behind us, let's take off on our first segment. Our saint tonight isn't technically a saint. He's a blessed martyr, one notch below a saint. But his feast day is 2 days from now, on September 3, And the story behind his martyrdom is so fascinating and so well illustrates all the themes of One Whirling Adventure that I think you'll agree it's worthy to be the inaugural story in this series. Let's begin with the saint story in the format that these stories are often told in devotional guides. Bartolomé Gutiérrez was born in Mexico City in 1580. When he was 17, he entered holy orders in the Augustinian monastery there. In 1612, he was sent as a missionary to Japan by way of the Philippines. After only 2 years in Japan, he was exiled as the persecution of Christians worsened, but he chose to return 4 years later. He spent 15 years in Japan in the midst of a bloody persecution. In 1629, Gutierrez and another Augustinian brother, a native Japanese, were arrested. After 2 years in prison, they and 6 others, including 2 women, were tortured by being scalded alive in hot sulfur springs for a month. On September 3, 1632, they were taken to the Hill of Martyrs in Nagasaki and burned alive. Their ashes were thrown into the ocean. And now, let's discover the story behind the saint. The name of the country is Nippon, which means origin of the sun, because the sun rises over their islands before shining on the Asian mainland to the west. Japan is only about 100 miles from the Asian mainland, but it has always been defined by its relationship to the sea, and through much of its history, the oceans around it fostered an isolated and inward-looking culture. Christianity arrived in Japan in 1549, brought by the Portuguese missionary priest Saint Francis Xavier, co-founder of the Jesuit order. It was a long journey for Father Xavier and the Portuguese Jesuits, literally to the ends of the earth. The Portuguese route to Japan went from Lisbon, south around the Horn of Africa to Mozambique, on to Goa in India, through the Malacca Straits, to the Portuguese trading base in Macau near modern Hong Kong. From there, they made their way to Kyushu, the southern island of Japan. When St. Francis Xavier and the Portuguese Jesuits arrived, they found a field ripe for harvest. Catholicism blossomed on Kyushu, the most southwesterly of Japan's home islands, and particularly around Nagasaki, the main harbor that interacted with the Asian mainland. After 50 years, only a few generations, there were an estimated 300,000 or more practicing Catholics in Japan. Hundreds of churches had been built throughout the country, not just on Kyushu, but as far as the north end of Honshu Island. The church included Japanese from every social level, from peasants to samurai feudal lords. Half the Jesuits and other religious brothers at this time were Japanese natives. Nagasaki became known as the Rome of the Far East, the Catholic capital of East Asia. Most of its inhabitants were Christians. It was divided into 8 parishes with 10 churches, including one for Korean immigrants. The church there was sending missionaries to Korea. There were Catholic schools and hospitals, including one for lepers. There were Catholic monasteries and convents. There was even a printing press, producing thousands of Catholic books in the Japanese language. By the end of the 16th century, the Buddhist and Shinto religions had essentially been replaced by Catholicism around Nagasaki. But this flourishing Catholic culture worried the shoguns, the military rulers of Japan. They became increasingly concerned about foreign colonial influences. So, in 1587, they banned the Portuguese Jesuits from entering the country, and 26 Jesuits and Franciscans, 17 of whom were native Japanese, were martyred in Nagasaki. They were crucified and then pierced with spears in mockery of Christ's own death. The 26 martyrs of Nagasaki were canonized in 1862 and are also known as St. Paul Mikian Companions. We have an episode planned for February to tell their story. With the Jesuits banned from entry, it fell to other religious orders to continue the missionary work in Japan. The Dominicans and Franciscans sent friars and priests, and so did the Augustinians. The Augustinians took their name from Saint Augustine, the towering father of the early church, who was Bishop of Hippo in what is now Algeria. Augustine's missionary vision was compelling, and during the Middle Ages a group of monks in Tuscany gained permission from the Pope to form the Augustinian order. Perhaps the most famous Augustinian monk lived in Wittenberg, Germany, where he nailed his complaints to the cathedral door in 1517 to start the Protestant Reformation. His name was Martin Luther. The Augustinian order spread to the New World with a presence in Mexico City. And there, in 1597, only 75 years after the Spanish conquest of the Aztecs, and 65 years after the Blessed Virgin Mary appeared to St. Juan Diego as Our Lady of Guadalupe, a 17-year-old Bartholomew Gutierrez took vows in the Augustinian order in Mexico City. After only a few years in the monastery there, he was sent to the Philippines, to Manila, which we'll visit later again in the final segment of this episode. After a few years there, in 1612, he was sent to Japan to be the prior of the Augustinian monastery in Usuki, not far from Nagasaki. The situation in Japan was changing rapidly. The military ruler of Japan was called the shogun. His feudal lords were called daimyos, and they had retinues of armed warriors, the samurai. And in 1603, after a civil war, the leader of the Tokugawa clan became shogun. The Tokugawa shogunate was determined to drive foreign influence from the home islands, and that meant extinguishing Catholicism. When Father Gutierrez entered Japan in 1612, the persecution of Christians was well underway. But only 2 years after he arrived, the shogun ordered all the missionaries expelled from the country and all the churches to be destroyed, and he was exiled back to the Philippines. Year by year after 1614, the number of martyrdoms grew. 55, 15, 25, 62, 88. The Japanese church meticulously recorded their heroic witness with their Japanese name, Christian name, and place of execution. Father Gutierrez had been exiled back to the Philippines in 1614, but it was in the midst of this persecution that he chose to return to Japan 4 years later to minister to these dear brothers and sisters who were making the ultimate sacrifice for their faith. In Nagasaki, on the 10th of September 1622, 9 Jesuits, 6 Dominicans, 4 Franciscans, and 6 lay Christians were put to death at the stake after witnessing the beheading of about 30 other Japanese lay Catholics. From December until the end of September 1624, there were 285 martyrs. The conviction of these followers of Christ is hard for us to imagine in the comfort of our time. An English sea captain, Richard Cox, who was in Japan at the time, reported back to the British government that he, quote, saw 55 martyred at Miyako at one time, and among them little children 5 or 6 years old, burned in their mother's arms, crying out, "Jesus, receive our souls." Many more are in prison who look hourly when they shall die, for very few will turn to paganism, even under sentence of death. With Catholicism so entrenched in Japan, how could the rulers stamp it out? To sort out the faithful from the marginally committed cultural Christians, to separate the sheep from the goats, the wheat from the weeds. In 1629, the government introduced the practice of fumi-yi. Fumi is the Japanese word for foot or step, and yi is the word for picture or image, so the term literally meant stepping on an image or stepping on a picture. To ferret out who the true Catholics were, the shoguns came up with a diabolically clever test. It's just a bit of bronze on a couple of sticks. It should mean nothing to you. So go ahead. Step on it. And you won't have to watch your family tortured to death before your eyes. At first, they used crucifixes, or paper pictures of Jesus or Mary. But with so many Catholics spread throughout the country, they needed to scale the persecution up with more efficient methods. And so an engraver in Nagasaki was commissioned to cast dozens of bronze plates from the melted down altars of demolished Catholic churches. These fumiyi still exist in museums and collections, and you can see the faces of Jesus and Mary worn down by the tens of thousands of feet. At the beginning of each month, everyone suspected of being a Christian was called upon to trample on the fumiyi in the presence of the authorities. If they refused, they were tortured by various exotic methods. Some were scalded repeatedly in hot springs. Some were hung upside down in pits of human excrement. Some were beheaded, burned, crucified. Some experienced all of the above. If this sounds familiar, some of it is recounted in a famous novel by the Japanese Catholic writer SHUSAKU ENDO, named Silence. Catholic colleges used to make it required reading, although I have no idea what they read these days. 2 years ago, the director Martin Scorsese made it into a film starring Liam Neeson. Now, I have a lot of thoughts about both the book and the film, and I'll share those in February when we return to Japan to hear the story behind St. Paul Mickey. Eventually, the people fought back, not only against the torture of Catholics, but for the loss of Catholic institutions, the hospitals and monasteries and schools and convents that provided so much for the needs of the poor. There was a people's revolt in 1637, the Shimabara Rebellion, but after some fierce skirmishes, the shogun's forces, aided by artillery from the Dutch, it was put down. When the rebellion was finally crushed, 4 remaining Catholic envoys from Macau were seized at Nagasaki, and after they refused to recant their Catholic faith, were put to death. The crushing of Catholic Christianity in Japan marked the beginning of the Edo period, a flourishing of the samurai culture. But as the samurai sun rose, it was setting on Christianity in Japan. It would not rise again for 250 years. The witness of Father Gutierrez and the other martyrs of Japan was like the last burst of sunlight before it drops below the horizon. The remaining Catholics went into hiding and became known as the Kukuri Kirishitan, literally the hidden Christians of Japan. In 1868, the Edo period came to an end, and foreigners were allowed to re-enter the country. Catholic missionaries returned and discovered that for 250 years the Kukuri Kirishitan had tried to preserve their Catholic faith. With the borders locked down and Bibles and Catholic books burned, their faith had become an oral tradition. They had no priests to administer the sacraments, so they had baptized their own children and taught them the prayers and hymns. They had preserved the liturgical calendar. They disguised elements of their faith, reciting Catholic prayers or singing hymns to Buddhist or Shinto melodies so as not to arouse the suspicion of their neighbors. They adapted their Catholic art and iconography to look like Buddhist or Shinto symbols. This is a statue of Mary and Jesus, given a Buddhist look to blend in. This is the crest of a Christian family. Notice the cross hidden in the design. In 1865, some of the hidden Christians around Nagasaki came to see the first new Catholic church in Japan, built by French missionaries. A French priest named Bernard Petitjean recorded that a Japanese Christian woman stepped forward to speak for the group. She told of how they had kept their Catholic faith over the centuries, and then she asked the priest 3 things. Was there a real statue of the Virgin Mary in the church that they could see with their own eyes? Was there a real priest, ordained and celibate? And had the priest really been sent to them by the Pope in Rome? Father Petitjean said yes, all of that is true. And then the Japanese brothers and sisters that had been hiding came forward in joy and entered the church in tears. 20 to 30,000 Catholics, less than 10% of the faithful when Nagasaki was the Rome of Japan, emerged from a 250-year shadow to receive the sacraments once again. Their story shocked the Catholic world. The French priest sent his description to Pope Pius IX, who called it a miracle and canonized many of the martyrs of Japan. The Catholic Church has always felt a special pain in its heart over the atomic bombing of Nagasaki because of the city's history and ground there made sacred by the witness of its martyrs. If you visit Nagasaki today, you can visit a park and a museum at ground zero of the atomic bombing. But Nagasaki has also become a remarkable Catholic pilgrimage destination. There are dozens of Catholic sites and shrines. Even the United Nations has designated them as UNESCO World Heritage Sites, called the Hidden Christian Sites in the Nagasaki region. You may have never heard this story that we've told tonight, this amazing tale about the flourishing of the church and then the hidden Christians in Japan. You know, in preparing for this episode, I checked one of the most popular textbooks on missions used in evangelical Protestant colleges and seminaries that I still have on my shelf. In 750 pages, it doesn't mention the story of the Japanese church one time. It only makes some passing reference that Jesuit missionaries in Asia produced no lasting spiritual benefits for the people over the centuries. Well, for many today, the hidden Christians of Japan are still hidden, but not after tonight. What does all of this have to say to us today? The Catholic Church in Japan is in decline once again, just like it is in the United States. But this time, it isn't the government demanding that we disavow our faith. Yet. No, we're losing it to consumerism, to postmodern values. But it's not out of the range of possibility that some 21st century version of a Fumi test could be put before us, demanding us to prove that our faith is not the most important thing in our lives. If we ever find ourselves in that position, perhaps we can draw strength from the story of the Christians of Japan. The Vatican has carefully investigated the cases of the Japanese martyrs. The Japanese Church kept meticulous records of the martyrs, including their Japanese and Christian names, the date and place of their martyrdom, and so forth. Over the last 200 years, the popes have beatified and canonized several different lists. There are the 26 martyrs of Nagasaki, the 205 martyrs of Japan, the Augustinian Recollects, and another group of 185 that were beatified in 2008 by Pope Benedict. All in all, nearly 400 Japanese martyrs have been beatified or canonized. But that doesn't include the hundreds or thousands of lay Catholics for which there were insufficient records. I'll close with the opening sentence from the official Catholic Encyclopedia's article about the Japanese martyrs. There is not, in the whole history of the Church, a single people who can offer to the admiration of the Christian world annals as glorious and a martyrology as lengthy as those of the people of Japan.
Oh, for 1,000 tongues to sing my great Redeemer's praise, the glories of my God and King, the triumphs of His grace. The glories of my God and King, the triumphs of His grace. My gracious Master and my God, assist me to proclaim, to spread through all the earth abroad the honors of Thy name. To spread through all the earth abroad the honors of Thy name. Jesus, the name that charms our fears, that bids our sorrows cease. 'Tis music in the sinner's ears, 'tis life and health and peace. 'Tis music in the sinner's ears, 'tis life and health and peace. He breaks the power of canceled sin, He sets the prisoner free. His blood can make the foulest clean, His blood availed for me. His blood can make the foulest clean, His blood availed for me.
I wanted to open this series with the story behind Blessed Bartolome Gutierrez for two reasons. Because his feast day is September 3, 2 days from when this episode airs. And because I can't think of a better example of the one whirling adventure that is the Catholic story. I mean, just think about it. In Mexico City, just a few generations after the conversion of the Aztecs, a boy joins the Augustinian order and sails halfway around the world to the land of the rising sun, where he serves a suffering church founded by Jesuit missionaries from Portugal. He gives his life in heroic witness to Christ and inspires Japanese Catholics to keep their faith in secret for 250 years during the golden age of the samurai. It's breathtaking. And now you know the story behind the saint.
Hello, I'm Audrey Thomas, the new Director of Sacred Music here at Our Lady of the Lake in Holland, Michigan. And today I'd like to invite you to sign up for a new class that we're offering through Lane this fall, an Introduction to Sacred Music. In this class, we're going to begin by addressing a few questions. What is sacred music? How does the Church define it? And how does our knowledge and our understanding of sacred music impact the way that we worship and enhance the way that we participate in the liturgy? In the first few classes, we're going to take apart the musical elements of the Mass and talk about the purpose behind each part and the musical choices that we have, as well as the importance of planning music that results in a cohesive and unified liturgy. I'm going to also discuss the rhythm of the liturgical year and point out some examples of the particular musical characteristics of each liturgical season. Throughout the class, other topics will include hymnody, sacred choral music, the effect that sacred spaces have on sacred music, and the universality of the Church's music throughout the world. This class is designed to provide an understanding of sacred music's integral connection to liturgy and an exposure to the rich treasury of sacred music that the Catholic Church offers us today. There will be plenty of opportunities for questions and discussion along the way, as well as video and audio examples of the music that we discuss. Sign up today at lanecatholic.org, and I hope to see you on September 23rd.
Hagia Sophia overlooks the sea. The smell of the sea is always around it. The sound of seagulls is always over it. The boats are always in front of it. And so, for this virtual pilgrimage tonight to the Hagia Sophia, I thought I'd give you a little bit of a taste for what it's like to actually be there. And since we're the Lakeshore Academy for the New Evangelization, I'm here on the shores of Lake Michigan to give you that sense. And if we ever travel there together for a pilgrimage, let this be a little bit of a foretaste.
Let's go to Turkey, to Istanbul, one of the great cities of world history. Istanbul has 18 million residents. For comparison, Los Angeles has 4 million and New York City has 8 million, which means that the city of Istanbul is home to more people than Los Angeles and New York City combined. Let's go to the Hagia Sophia, one of the oldest, greatest, and most important churches in the history of Christendom. Istanbul is a city bisected by one of the world's most important waterways. Istanbul is a transcontinental city. The city itself straddles both the European and Asian landmasses. Half of the city is in Europe and half is in Asia, because it's built on the hills on both sides of the Bosporus.
To understand the significance of the Hagia Sophia, it helps to understand the significance of where it's located. So let's use a little local analogy to try to make sense of it. Out there is Lake Michigan. It leads on to the rest of the Great Lakes and ultimately to the Atlantic Ocean and the entire globe. And in there is Lake Macatawa. It's the gateway to the agricultural and industrial productivity of West Michigan. And this is the narrow channel that connects the two. Now, if we were in Istanbul, we'd be standing in the heart of the old city, on the Golden Horn, just about where the Hagia Sophia sits. In our analogy, Lake Michigan would be the Sea of Marmara, and the Great Lakes the Mediterranean. And Lake Makatawa would be the Black Sea, the gateway to Russia, Central Asia, and the Silk Road to China. And this channel would be the Bosphorus, the channel or strait that connects the Black Sea ultimately to the rest of the world through the Mediterranean. The Bosphorus is only 19 miles long, and at one point it narrows to only 800 yards wide. It's the world's narrowest strait used for international shipping. And because the city of Istanbul straddles the Bosphorus, it's a transcontinental city. We're standing in Europe, and on that side of the channel is Asia. So, we're standing at, arguably, the most important intersection of the ancient world. And that's where the Hagia Sophia was built.
If you travel to Rome and visit the Colosseum, and you look just 100 yards or so to the side of the Colosseum, you'll see the Arch of Constantine. Now, you can't tell the story of Christianity without talking about the Roman Emperor Constantine the Great. Marks of his impact are everywhere in the ancient Catholic world. 200 years after St. Peter and St. Paul were martyred in Rome, the empire divided into two halves, the Latin-speaking West and the Greek-speaking East. The eastern side was wealthier and stronger. And civil wars broke out over control over the parts of the empire. A young nobleman named Constantine was born in the Roman province of Dacia, or modern Serbia. To avoid assassination by his political rivals, he fled by riding non-stop to Roman Britain, burning up horses between army forts. He spent a year fighting the Pict tribes along Hadrian's Wall, when he heard that a power vacuum had created an opportunity for him to make a play for power back in Rome. He gathered his legions and fought his way back across Europe to Ravenna and then on to Rome. Outside Rome, before the final battle that would decide the Civil War, he had a vision of the Christian cross in the sky. He put the cross on his soldiers' shields and won the battle. Historians argue about just how sincere Constantine's conversion was and what his motives really were, but I think that his deeds speak for themselves. He legalized and endorsed Christianity. He built the first St. Peter's Basilica. Rome is full of relics gathered and churches built by his mother, St. Helena. Constantine brought the bishops of the world together for the Council of Nicaea that produced the Nicene Creed that we recite every week in Mass. Constantine had grown up on the frontier provinces of the Eastern Empire. He believed that the future of the empire was in the East. That's where the resources, commerce, and wealth were. And that's where the real threats were, from Persia and Central Asia. The Emperor Constantine was determined to build a new capital for the Roman Empire. Bigger, better, more powerful. He built it on the Golden Horn, at the intersection of Asia and Europe, where the Great Sea and the Black Sea meet. He called it Nova Roma, New Rome. The citizens called it Megalopolis, the Great City. Its massive walls stood, unconquerable, for 11 centuries.
On top of the highest hill in Nova Roma, he built the first version of the Hagia Sophia. It was the cathedral church of the capital of the New Rome, the seat of the bishop or patriarch of the city. Because they were the bishops of the capital of the new and improved empire and pastors advisors to the emperor, the patriarchs would come to see themselves as independent of or even surpassing the Pope, the bishop of the old Rome. 500 years later, that perspective would have disastrous consequences for the entire Christian world. Now, the Eastern Empire spoke Greek, not Latin. Hagia is the Greek word for holy, and Sophia is the Greek word for wisdom. So Hagia Sophia is Greek for holy wisdom. So the name of the church is the Church of Holy Wisdom. And the reasons for that name are actually pretty fascinating. The Old Testament sometimes personifies wisdom, which is hukmah in Hebrew. In books like Proverbs and Wisdom, hukmah is said to have existed before the creation of the world and to have in some way participated in the creation of the world. It sometimes speaks of wisdom as if it were a holy force or a holy being in the Old Testament. Holy wisdom, or Hagia Sophia, refers to this personified sense of wisdom that the Old Testament sort of articulates. The ancient church saw a conceptual parallel between the Hagia Sophia and Christ, who St. John refers to with a similar concept in Greek, the concept of logos, which is literally the Greek word for word. The Gospel of John opens by declaring that in the beginning was the logos, or the word, and that the word was with God and that the word was God. Now, the Greek churches in the East were always more comfortable than the Latin church in the West with drawing a connection or a parallel between the Hagia Sophia, the holy wisdom in the Old Testament, and the Word made flesh in Christ. But all those ideas were swirling all through the ancient church at the time the Hagia Sophia was built. So, the Church of Hagia Sophia was meant to be dedicated to the transcendent person of Christ, the eternal and holy and living Word of God, which they equated with that Old Testament sense of holy wisdom. In 360, the first church, called the Megala Ecclesia, or Great Church, was built on the site. It burnt down in riots in 404. A second version was dedicated in 415, but it also burnt down during riots that raged through the city in 532. There were a lot of riots in ancient Constantinople, apparently. And while those ruins were still smoldering, the emperor at the time, Justinian the Great, declared that he would rebuild it as the greatest church that had ever been built, to rival the Temple of Solomon. He chose 2 Greeks as architects, experts in geometry, mathematics, and engineering. And he committed all the resources that he had, and he told them to get it done as fast as possible. And they did. The Hagia Sophia was built in 70 months, just under 6 years after the riots that burnt down the previous church. It was dedicated on December 27, 537. And when it was done, the Emperor Justinian said, "Solomon, I have outdone thee."
Like most ancient church buildings, the Hagia Sophia has evolved over the ages. That region of the world is subject to earthquakes, and several earthquakes, as well as fires, have forced elements of the Hagia Sophia to be rebuilt over time. Several man-made catastrophes have also forced changes. In the 8th and 9th centuries, there was a theological movement called iconoclasm. The iconoclasts wanted to eliminate sacred images, like the icons of the Pantocrator or Theotokos. Some of the original images in the Hagia Sophia were removed or destroyed. Now I'll discuss the iconoclast movement in detail in episode 2 when we explore icons and sacred images, so join me for that. So, natural or man-made events have forced the Hagia Sophia's architecture and art to evolve over many centuries, but the same could be said about most of the great basilicas and cathedrals. In plan view, from above, the Hagia Sophia is designed around a rectangular central nave, with domes anchoring the 4 corners, and a larger main dome, the one featuring the Pantocrator, over the altar. The nave is 270 feet long, and with the side aisles, it is 240 feet wide, making the whole thing nearly square when viewed from above. The central dome is 108 feet in diameter, and rises 180 feet above the pavement. It was the most formidable architectural achievement of its age. In elevation view, from the side, you can see that it has 2 floor levels. The main or ground level, on which the altar is positioned, and a gallery level over the side aisles, in a style similar to a Roman loggia. The galleries allowed more people to observe the Mass, and at various times the galleries were used either by lower status common people or sometimes by the imperial delegation itself. No discussion of the Hagia Sophia would be complete without mentioning the engineering achievement of suspending a dome of those dimensions at that height. For those of you fascinated by architecture and engineering, there's a vast amount of material on this topic, so let me just touch on a couple of points. Before the Hagia Sophia, the largest freestanding dome was the Pantheon in Rome, built 500 years before the Hagia Sophia, which every tourist or pilgrim to that city has no doubt seen. No one would figure out how to build a bigger, larger, higher dome than the Hagia Sophia for another 1,000 years, when Brunelleschi built the dome over the Cathedral of Florence in Italy, and then Michelangelo and others raised an even larger one over St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. All of these domes are freestanding stone, built with compression masonry. The challenge was always how to support the weight of the dome without an internal steel structure. The Pantheon did it by making the walls incredibly thick and dense. Tourists to Rome don't notice it, but the walls of the Pantheon are 20 feet thick with no windows to weaken them, except for the obvious hole in the center of the roof, which actually reduced the weight of the dome. But the Greek engineers who built the Hagia Sophia wanted it flooded with light. Their ingenious solution was to build 4 concave piers called pendentives. The enormous weight of the central dome rests entirely on the pendentives, which allows the walls to be perforated by windows. On the concave surface of these pendentives are frescoes of seraphim. The Old Testament book of Isaiah describes the throne room of God. In it, the Lord is served by these angelic beings, described as having 6 wings, 1 set covering its feet, 1 set covering its face, and 1 set to fly. The effect in the Hagia Sophia is to reinforce that the icon of Christ Pantocrator at the top of the dome is the incarnated God of the Old Testament. His throne above is attended to by the seraphim on the pendentives, which rise upward but do not reach to his level. The architecture creates an ethereal space for liturgy and sacred music. A few years ago, engineers at Stanford University created a virtual computer model of the interior of the Hagia Sophia. The model digitally reproduces the acoustics of the original space under the central dome, with an incredible 12-second reverb decay. They then worked with Cappella Romana, a professional vocal ensemble that performs sacred classical music in the Christian traditions of East and West. Cappella Romana sang the Eastern liturgy as it would have been performed more than 1,000 years ago. They produced the first vocal album in the world to be recorded entirely in live virtual acoustics, Lost Voices of the Hagia Sophia, medieval Byzantine chant. The result is that for the first time in centuries, we can actually hear what the liturgy sounded like in the Hagia Sophia. This is Psalm 140.
If the Hagia Sophia is a sermon written in stone, then it's a sermon with 3 points. First point, the divine Logos, the holy wisdom, Jesus Christ, is the Pantocrator, in Greek, the all-powerful.
The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. At the apex of the central dome is the holiest icon of Eastern Christianity, the image of Christ Pantocrator. Now I'll explain the Pantocrator icon in detail in episode 2 of One Whirling Adventure, but it's a representation of Christ as Yahweh, the one who is that he is. And at the top of what would be the world's highest freestanding dome for another 1,000 years, Christ Pantocrator looked down.
Second point, his throne is at the apex of heaven, above all things, surrounded by light. And there is an order of being, or levels of heaven, with angels and saints rising up to give him praise.
The Hagia Sophia is full of windows. The previously tallest dome in the Roman Empire, the Pantheon in Rome, has no windows because the walls couldn't bear the weight of being perforated. But what made the Hagia Sophia ingenious was that the walls were pierced with dozens of windows, and they are arranged in tiers around the central dome. They convey the light of heaven into the central nave, and above and around each tier are artistic representations of saints and angelic beings. But Christ is above the highest tier of windows. The image of the Pantocrator floats in regions of infinite space and light.
Third point, wisdom has built a house, and she is the Blessed Virgin Mary, the Theotokos, the Mother of God.
In a classic church, the apse is the space above and behind the altar. It looks down on the sacrifice of the Eucharist, and the people look up past the body and blood of Christ to whatever art is represented in the apse. In the Hagia Sophia, the apse is an icon of Mary, and that has an important connection with the name of the church, because Mary is not depicted alone, but as the Theotokos, the God-bearer or Mother of God. Mary is not God, of course, but she is the greatest of the created beings because she is the one who brings the Pantocrator into this world. In Proverbs, Holy Wisdom speaks, saying, "I have built a house for myself." The Church Fathers saw this as a reference to the Incarnation. The divine Logos, the Hagia Sophia, made a house for himself in the person of Jesus Christ. But if you back that up one step, you realize that the Word made a house for himself when he created the Virgin Mary who would bear him. She is the tabernacle of the new covenant.
One of the great tragedies of the Christian story happened in 1054 AD. Over the centuries, a terrible gap had grown between the Western Church, led by the Bishop of the Old Rome, the Pope, and the Eastern Church, led by the Patriarch of Constantinople, ostensibly the New Rome. Now, maybe someday I'll do a whole episode about this, the Great East to West Schism, but doctrinal and practical gaps had opened up between the Eastern and Western churches. And to be honest, some of these were serious theological differences. For example, disputes arose over a whole host of matters, including the relationship of the Holy Spirit to the third person of the Trinity, the second person of the Trinity, the Son. There were Eucharistic differences, the dating of Easter, and things of that nature. And over the centuries, the East and West had really kind of grown apart. I mean, the intellectual alienation between them was real. It's a genuine difference. But these gaps were exacerbated by distance, language, and culture. During the height of the empire, Roman Constantinople had been connected by regular communications. I mean, you could travel between the two of them inside 2 weeks, and people did every day. But the Roman world had been torn apart over the centuries by invasions, wars, plagues for 500 years. I mean, travel between the capitals was dangerous, and it had become infrequent. And regular communications and interactions between the two, and between the two governments and between the two churches, had broken down. And they spoke different languages, Latin and Greek. During the height of the empire, educated people and their elite, all of the ruling class, they all spoke both. But by the year 1000, there were very few people who could be found that were, actually bilingual. The leaders on both sides, they literally couldn't understand what the other side was saying. And a lot was lost through translators, especially on, technical theological points. And their cultures had evolved. I mean, both sides had different lifestyles, different practices. They dressed differently, they sang different songs, they had different liturgies, celebrated different feast days, in some cases honored different saints. So it was nearly impossible to resolve these doctrinal disputes when they literally didn't understand or even really like each other. And their politics put them at odds. See, the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, obviously, and still does, claimed primacy and jurisdiction over all the other bishops of the world as the successor of Peter, since Peter had been the first bishop of Rome and the Pope was his successor. But the patriarchs of Constantinople argued that since they were the bishops of the new Rome, they were not subject to the bishop of the old Rome. And so the stage was set for, at the very least, a massive misunderstanding and a chaotic disaster at the worst. And the worst case scenario played out. In a scene which would be hard to believe if it was in a Hollywood movie, in 1054, the papal ambassador to Constantinople walked into the Hagia Sophia itself during Mass and slapped the document on the altar, excommunicating the patriarch in the Pope's name. The problem was that the Pope in Rome didn't know because he had died several weeks earlier. And because of the breakdown in regular communications, the ambassador didn't know the Pope was dead. And he issued the excommunication on his own authority, but in the Pope's name. Well, the patriarch returned the favor, and he excommunicated the ambassador and the entire papal delegation, their whole diplomatic corps. And then things fell apart from there. This was the great East-West schism of 1054, which has divided the Roman Catholic Church from the Greek and Russian Orthodox churches ever since. Again, maybe someday we'll do a whole episode about this, but suffice it to say that the wound has never completely been healed. And to this day, there are not only practical differences, but in some cases, doctrinal differences between the two. And so, except for a few decades in the 13th century when Western forces controlled the city of Constantinople, the Hagia Sophia ceased to be a Catholic church 1,000 years ago.
During this brief virtual pilgrimage, you've no doubt noticed that in every photo, the Hagia Sophia is full of Islamic calligraphy and symbols obscuring the Christian imagery. That's because of what happened in 1453. That 1453 isn't an instantly recognizable date in world history, like 1492 or 1776, is a failure of our educational system. Few dates have been as significant in the course of world history. The Western Roman Empire collapsed 50 years before the Hagia Sophia was even built. The empire continued to live on in the East, though. It has been called the Byzantine Empire, but they thought of themselves as Rome and called themselves Romans. 200 years after the Hagia Sophia was built, an Arabian named Muhammad declared himself to be the last of the prophets and launched a new religion, Islam. Islamic armies tore through the fragmented wreckage of the Roman Empire, rolling up former provinces and cities that could no longer defend themselves. Nova Roma was the last bastion of Roman Christendom in the east. Its massive walls on the stronghold of the Golden Horn, its armies and navy, held out for over 700 years against every invader that tried to take it. But, isolated and battered over the centuries, in 1453 its legendary walls were breached by the Ottoman Turks under the leadership of Mehmet the Conqueror. The last Roman emperor, ironically named Constantine XI in homage to the founder of Nova Roma, died in the final assault on the walls of the Golden Horn on May 29, 1453. The first thing that the conquerors did was rush inside of the Hagia Sophia and batter in the doors, raping and enslaving the women and children hidden inside. And then a Muslim cleric stood by the altar and recited the Shahada, the words that consecrated it as an Islamic mosque. Many of the Christian frescoes and mosaics were removed. Others were hidden with these large calligraphy signs. Interestingly, the one mosaic that they left visible and prominent was the Theotokos in the apse, because Muslims have a great respect for Mary. She is mentioned 70 times in the Quran, more than she is in the Bible. The Muslims made other changes. They removed the altar. They carpeted the nave. They added these 4 minarets at the corners of the building to make it resemble an Islamic mosque from the outside. Mehmet the Conqueror added Sultan of Rome to his list of titles. He saw the Hagia Sophia as a trophy of war, a symbol of Islam's superiority over Christianity. And then it was a mosque for almost 500 years. But after World War I, Turkey was transformed into a secular nation. They adopted a new constitution that committed to separate government from religion and guarantee religious freedom to both Muslims and Christians. And so, in 1935, the Hagia Sophia was transformed from a mosque, not back into a church, but into an interfaith museum. Throughout the 20th century, there were renovations and old Christian frescoes and mosaics were restored. It became an interfaith landmark for all the people of Turkey, Muslim and Christian, and a World Heritage Site for tourists and pilgrims. And it stayed that way until just 5 weeks before this episode is scheduled to air. In July of 2020, the president of Turkey, Recep Erdogan, declared the 1935 Accord concerning the Hagia Sophia invalid and converted it back into a mosque. On July 24, 2020, Muslim prayers were held in it again. The Christian world was outraged just a month ago. Pope Francis, during his noontime Angelus address, said, "The sea carries my thoughts further, to Istanbul. I'm thinking of the Hagia Sophia, and I am very pained." The Greek Orthodox Patriarch said that this would not heal the rifts between the Islamic and Christian worlds, but only lead to greater division. The United States Council of Catholic Bishops decried the decision by Erdogan and urged him to return the Hagia Sophia to be a heritage site for all people. And the bishops asked for all Christians and people of goodwill to join in a day of mourning on July 24, 2020 for the Hagia Sophia.
The purpose of this program, One Whirling Adventure, is to tell the story of how the Catholic Church has twirled and twisted through time and space, contending for the faith that was, once and for all entrusted to the saints. And I don't think that there's a single church building in the world that better illustrates not only the glories and successes of the Catholic story, but also the complex challenges that Catholicism has faced along the way. And I don't think there's a single church building that I can think of that forces us to face the complexity of the Catholic story. Because while the Hagia Sophia is no longer a Catholic church,
the Catholic Church has really sort of never given itself away to defend it for its own sake. It would have been easy for the popes at different points along the way to concede doctrinal points here or make political accommodations there. The Hagia Sophia is kind of like a family tree. You look back on it and you see who we were and how we got to where we are. But I don't think that the story is over. I mean, it would be foolish to believe that the last chapter has been written for this 1,500-year-old landmark. It may not happen in our lifetimes, but I feel pretty certain that there are more surprises to come in the story of the Hagia Sophia. In the meantime, the Holy Father and our bishops have asked us to pray for and keep the Hagia Sophia in our prayer intentions. And so, for no other reason than that, I think it's been worth a virtual pilgrimage, and maybe a real pilgrimage. If you're interested in coming with me to Istanbul to see the Hagia Sophia, then message me at Lane. I'm planning on offering a trip there sometime in the next year or two.
Introducing Lane Kids. Lane Kids is a self-paced virtual learning option for faith formation. In these uncertain times, Lane Kids is an adventure in learning for kindergarten to 5th grade students. The learning platform is easy to navigate and supports students and parents, making growing in faith simple and fun. Lane Kids follows the new curriculum set forth by the Diocese of Grand Rapids. Whole parishes in the diocese are signing up, and any family, no matter where they live, can take advantage of Lane Kids too. With guided meditations, experiential moments such as live online adoration, interactive lessons, and exciting crafts and activities, Lane Kids is here to support you in all your elementary faith formation needs. Sign up at lanecatholic.org.
Lane has other classes coming this fall. Go to lanecatholic.org and click Catalog at the top. Find The Life and Times of St. Paul, Apostle to the Gentiles, a 7-week interactive virtual classroom on Mondays beginning September 21. We're also offering The Parables of Jesus, a discussion-based virtual classroom on Wednesdays for 7 weeks beginning September 23. Virtual classrooms are available with the All Access Pass. For our final segment of the episode, let's look at a uniquely Catholic object, Marian processions. As we'll see in this segment, Catholics all around the world love marching in Marian processions to celebrate her major feast days. But of all the things Protestants distrust and find distasteful about Catholicism, near the top of the list is all this parading about with statues of Mary. Not long after I'd converted to Catholicism, I ran into an old friend at a dinner party. He's a well-respected Christian author and speaker and evangelical Protestant. We hadn't probably seen each other in 6 or 8 years, but he'd heard from friends in the meantime that I had become Catholic. So we have this sort of awkward conversation, because from his perspective, I'm sort of playing for the other team now. We're sort of staring at our wine glasses and trying to think of something to say, but he's a good man and he wants to say something nice. So he says something like, you know, I love reading Catholic philosophers when they write on logic or pro-life or biomedical ethics, things like that. They're so insightful and cogent. He says, you know, there's something really attractive about the Catholic intellectual tradition. And I'm like, and then he says, but I knew there was a but coming. But, he said, Catholicism as it's actually practiced seems to me to be nothing but folk religion, parading about with statues of the Virgin Mary and candles and whatnot.
And I'm thinking, how do I respond to this at a dinner party? Well, if I'd been quick enough on my feet then, or if he's listening now, here's what I'd say.
The same Catholic intellectual tradition that my evangelical friends admire so much, and all the great minds that it produced, also produced Marian devotion. They can't have it both ways. The philosophers that they call insightful and cogent saw no contradiction between rigorous thought and parading about with statues of Mary, because they grasped that at its core, in its essence, Christianity is an incarnate religion, not just a belief system. And it's centered on the act of the incarnation, which Mary's fiat, her yes at the Annunciation, made possible. As the Church Fathers often pointed out, the first Eve's no to God's will brought about sin and death, but the new Eve's yes brought about salvation and life. We'll take up the issue of statues, holy images and icons, in episode 2, so join me for that. But for now, where does this whole parading about with statues of Mary come from? And why do we Catholics do so much of it? To begin to answer that question, let's travel southeast from the Hagia Sophia, just 230 miles to the ancient city of Ephesus. During the Roman Empire, Ephesus was an important center of commerce and culture along the coast of Asia Minor. It was famous for its temple to Artemis and great amphitheater. St. Paul helped to start a church in Ephesus, and a few years later wrote a letter of advice and instruction to the Christians there, the Epistle to the Ephesians. But Ephesus also has ancient connections with the Virgin Mary. One of the last things Jesus did on the cross was to entrust the care of his mother to John, the beloved apostle. No doubt, John took that responsibility very seriously for the rest of her life. The historians in the early church said that the apostle John settled here in Ephesus, teaching and training disciples, and lived here until his death when he was nearly 100 years old. There is a tradition, and to be clear, it's not an authoritative church teaching, and thus it's not a matter of faith. It can't be proven or disproven for that matter. But tradition says that John brought Jesus' mother, the Virgin Mary, to Ephesus to live with him. Believe it or not, the story goes that, to keep Mary safe from harassment or persecution from the authorities, John had a small house built for her on a mountain that overlooks the city, about a 3-hour walk from town. It would be here, therefore, that she fell asleep in the Lord and was assumed into heaven, what the Catholic Church calls her dormition. You can visit the house, and if you come with me on our next lane pilgrimage to Turkey, we will. Now, my Protestant friends might consider all of this to be nonsensical Catholic mythology. But consider this. In the book of Revelation, John clearly states that he received the revelation while he was exiled by the Roman government on the island of Patmos. The early church historians record that he was living in Ephesus. And where exactly is Patmos? Only 59 miles as the crow flies from Ephesus, and the house that tradition holds the Virgin Mary lived out her days in. John's tomb is also in Ephesus, and both his tomb and Mary's house are visited not only by Christians, but by Muslims in Turkey, because Muslims have a great respect for Mary. So, Ephesus already had something of a connection with Mary, but it doesn't end there. 4 centuries later, a doctrinal controversy arose in the church over the nature of Jesus' human body. The Archbishop of Constantinople, named Nestorius, began teaching that Jesus' humanity was merely an instrument used by the Son's divine nature to temporarily accomplish his bodily mission of salvation. Under this view, Mary would merely be the mother of the man, Jesus Christ. But this tore at the doctrine of Christ. The church taught that Jesus was both fully God and fully man. He had two natures, but they were fused together into one inseparable identity, what the early church theologians called hypostatic union. Scripture tells us that he would be named Emmanuel, in Hebrew, God with us. To his critics, Jesus said, "Before Abraham was, I am." In the Transfiguration, he revealed to Peter, James, and John that he was fully the Lord God, not just a divine spirit in a human body. St. Paul said that all the fullness of God's deity dwelt in the body of Jesus Christ, that he is the firstborn of creation, that he was before all things, that all things were created through him and for him, and in him all things are held together. And so, in 431 AD, the bishops of the world assembled at Ephesus to decide the matter. After much deliberation and prayer, the Council of Ephesus declared that because the Lord Jesus Christ was fully God, his mother Mary was not merely a teenage girl who just gave birth to the body that God used, but became, by the mystery of the Incarnation, retroactively what they called in Greek the Theotokos, the Mother of God. She is the new Eve, whose yes redeemed us from the first Eve's no. She is the tabernacle of the new covenant, for the fullness of God's deity dwelt in her womb. And therefore, she is the mother of the church, which is the mystical body of Christ. When Jesus said to John, "Behold your mother," and to Mary, "Behold your son," he gave her to all of us as our mother, Our Lady. The final session of the council lasted well into the evening. And when the final vote was taken and the decision announced to the people lining the streets, they burst out in joy and celebration. The ancient historians wrote that, gathered outside the church doors, in enthusiastic anticipation of the assembly's decision, was what seemed to be the entire population of Ephesus. As soon as the news of what was decided leaked through the portals, the rejoicing was unparalleled. It was said that the whole city became as though sunlit with torches, and devotional pageantry exploded in the streets. The fathers of the council were escorted back to their residences with incense and singing, and amid such protestations of affection that the humility of the humblest of saints would have been put to a difficult test. In a sense, that night in 431 AD was the first recorded torchlight procession in honor of the Blessed Virgin Mary, our Mother, Our Lady. And ever since, Catholics, who it seems have always loved the parade, have processed with images of the Blessed Mother on her key feast days, like the Annunciation, the Assumption, the Immaculate Conception, and others, depending on local custom. And in truth, why should we not parade about honoring Our Lady? The world holds parades and marches in the street for so many lesser things. Why should we not parade about from time to time, proclaiming and celebrating truth, goodness, and beauty? The truth of the Incarnation, the goodness of Mary's total submission to God's will, and the beauty of the one who Wordsworth called our tainted nature's solitary boast. Marian processions are the act of taking this truth, goodness, and beauty to the street, to proclaim within our communities that the Incarnation really happened, that there is good in this world, and we can look to our Blessed Mother for beauty in a world that is often so ugly. We tolerate parades and marches for commercialism, for celebrities, for war, for perversity, and every sort of ugly and angry political cause, which leaves behind broken windows, trashed streets, and burning buildings. But what a powerful witness it is for humble men, women, and children to walk those same streets from time to time, honoring the one who the angel Gabriel hailed as full of grace, and for faithful men, women, and children to do so with dignity and humility. I think it's beautiful and powerful. Lourdes, in southern France at the base of the Pyrenees, was the site of one of the most remarkable Marian apparitions in history, when Our Lady appeared to a young girl named Bernadette. Since then, Lourdes has become one of the most popular pilgrimage sites in the world. And you can learn all about it in a few weeks when One Whirling Adventure takes a virtual pilgrimage to France. Check the schedule on the Lane website and Facebook for dates. Now, every evening at Lourdes, there's a procession of the Blessed Sacrament at 5 p.m. And then at 9 p.m. a torchlight Marian procession, while the pilgrims pray the rosary and sing the beautiful Lourdes hymn, Immaculate Mary.
Wees gegroet Maria, vol van genade, de Heer is met u.
Magnificat, magnificat, anima mea Mon âme exalte le Seigneur, exulte mon esprit en Dieu. Proclama mi alma la grandeza del Señor, se alegra mi espíritu en Dios.
Let's travel now from Lourdes to Manila. The Philippines proudly calls itself the only Christian nation in Asia, where more than 86% of the population is Roman Catholic. Manila is a modern city, but it is devout in its devotion to Christ and to Our Lady. Every year on December 6, the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, it celebrates what might be the world's largest and most elaborate Marian procession. Held in front of the Cathedral of Manila in the historic Old City, the Intramuros Grand Marian Procession features more than 100 parade floats constructed by local parishes throughout the country. It is a national celebration of their faith and love for Our Lady. And now let's travel back from the Philippines to Europe, to the heart of Catholic Italy in Assisi. Last fall, we took a Lane pilgrimage to Italy, and we visited Assisi, the birthplace of St. Francis and the Franciscan movement. While we were there, we took place in an evening rosary service in the Basilica of St. Mary of the Angels, which was built over the Portiuncula, the little chapel that is the heart of the Franciscan order. With thousands of local Italians, we prayed the rosary and we processed with the statue of Santa Maria through the piazza and back into the basilica. Here's what it was like to be a part of that procession.
insigne devotionis, ora pro nobis, rosa mystica, ora pro nobis, turbis Davidica, ora pro nobis, turbis Seburnea, ora pro nobis, consolatrix afflictorum, ora pro nobis, auxilium Christianorum, ora pro nobis, Regina Angelorum, ora pro nobis, Regina Patriarcharum, ora pro nobis, Regina Prophetia, Regina Virginum, ora pro nobis, Regina Sanctorum Omnium.
Let's travel now from Assisi to a place that lost its Catholic identity 500 years ago, Oxford University, but since then has still produced some great Catholic thinkers and artists. Devout Catholic J.R.R. Tolkien put all sorts of Marian references into his masterwork, The Lord of the Rings, including that the evil ring of power was destroyed on March 25, the Feast of the Annunciation, the day that the Word was made flesh in Mary's womb, because of her yes, her willingness to follow God's will, just like the heroes in his story. One of those heroes, Sam, says something profound when they are discouraged by how ugly the world has become. Sam says, "In the end, it's only a passing thing, this shadow. Even darkness must pass. A new day will come, and when the sun shines, it will shine out the clearer. There is some good in this world, Mr. Frodo, and it's worth fighting for."
Immaculate Mary, your praises we sing. You reign now in splendor with Jesus our King. Ave, Ave, Ave Maria. Ave, Ave Maria. In heaven the blessed your glory proclaim. On earth we your children invoke your sweet name. Ave, Ave, Ave Maria. Ave, Ave Maria. We pray for the Church, our true Mother on earth, and beg you to watch o'er the land of our birth. Ave, Ave, Ave Maria. Ave, Ave Maria.
And so we come to the end of this maiden flight of One Whirling Adventure. I hope that tonight you've caught a glimpse of just how breathtaking the Catholic story is. And I hope that it's whet your appetite for more. I promise you that this season of One Whirling Adventure is going to be one wild ride. If you don't have a digital passport or all-access pass yet, go to lanecatholic.org to sign up and join us for the rest of this journey. If you do, then you should have an invitation to the after party in your email. So in a moment, you can log out of this session and log in to join me there. Oh, and don't forget to like and follow the Facebook page for bonus content between episodes. Thank you for your time, and God bless.